welcome back everyone to the healthcare case study. You may be watching this on our YouTube channel or Facebook group, Business Analyst and Scrum Master in Demand. The topic for today in our healthcare case study, we're in week 5 this week, and we'll be covering how do you create user stories. So in Agile, the way that we document and gather requirements are using user stories. In the waterfall scenario, if you're working in the waterfall methodology or teams, you would be at this point gathering requirements and documenting them in something called a BRD or business requirements document. We're doing this case study from an Agile standpoint. So what I'll be showing you today is how do you write correct user stories. There's lots of YouTube videos and lots of stuff out there that explains how do you write user stories. I want to go a little bit deeper and teach you guys how to add the acceptance criteria, which really helps in creating complete user stories, right? So here's a format that I'm sure most of you guys are very, very, very familiar with. You've seen it on Google, you've seen many other YouTube videos on it. This is the format that we use to create user stories. So as a user, I want something or the functionality so that I can do something. So I feel like for the user, it could be anybody that's in Agile. User stories are from a user perspective. And that's why what we do is in creating user stories, because they're customer focused, every time you're trying to write a user story, you should look to understand who is this functionality for and who is the primary benefactor of that functionality. So the functionality is the desired action. I have this incorrect. This is not the acceptance criteria. This is the justification, right? The acceptance criteria is different. So it should be, as a user, I want functionality so that, and this is the justification that we have for the user story, right? And justification is what it's doing is it's setting a parameter for value or result, right? And it allows, if you have the justification, it allows QA and testing purposes to use this to create test scripts and cases. So users from our scenario could be registered customers on the website that need to use recipes. They could be just visitors that are, browsing through our recipes, and our users can also be the admin folks that are managing and approving new recipes that are coming through. So anytime that you're thinking about writing a user story, think about who that functionality is specifically for. Okay. Here are some examples. This is not from our case study, but just some examples that we could use to get practice. As a patient who is the user, I want to log into my patient record from home. So this is the functionality so that I can check my appointment time. So this is a justification. Why are we writing about this feature? Is because we want to allow the patient to check their appointment time from home, right? As a patient, again, as a user, I want to log into my patient record from home so that I can check my doctor's notes. Again, the patient is a user. This is the functionality. And here's why we're building this functionality out. Because in knowing that we need to give somebody the ability to check the appointment time and check doctor's notes, we now know that the tasks that need to be broken out for these items for our developers need to allow the user to check notes, to have an area in their inbox somewhere to check notes, right? So even when you're writing user stories at this level, they're really, really high level. And that's why I want to talk about the acceptance criteria in the next few slides. Another example is, as a patient, I want to log into my patient record from home so that I can look at my lab results. As a patient, I want to log into my patient record from home so that I can send notes, messages to my doctor. So this at a high level gives you what functionality or features that we're trying to build, right? Now, if you add the acceptance criteria, why is it important and who uses the acceptance criteria are the most common questions that I get. The acceptance criteria written in this format, given, when, then, allows you to dive deeper into the user story, right? It allows you to give more detail on how it is that you want the functionality to be created, right? So if you read the first example, as a patient, I want to log into my patient record from home so that I can check my appointment time. Each and every person, we have a couple of people on the phone or on the call right now. Each and every one of you guys may interpret this differently. And therefore, it isn't a complete user story without the acceptance criteria. Now, if we are to have that user story as a patient, I want to log into my patient record from home so that I can check my appointment time, and you use the acceptance criteria in this format, given, when, then you're able to provide more detail to the developers and to everybody working on the project team in terms of how this should work, right? So let's look at this one more time. As a patient, I want to log into my patient record from home so that I can check my appointment time. Given that I log into the portal successfully, when I click on the tab for appointments and click on the appointments tab, then I'm able to see my past and future appointments. Now, with this clarity, isn't it a little bit clear on how the functionality should be created, right? It gives our developers a little bit more meaning in creating tasks that will need to be done to accommodate this user story. So I'll pause here for a second to see if you guys have any questions. Can you guys see how adding this acceptance criteria gives a lot more clarity to the user story than just the user story alone?
Let me do some comparison here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as if I take the Scrum Master, and he was in meeting with the product owner in order to get how the product owner want the product to be. So he got the they call it the epic. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. So once he got all those things from the product owner, that's the epic. And for the Scrum Master to get to give this to the developer, he has to break it in story and then in task. So that's the same thing that's happening here. So once you write the user story, it's at a high level. So for the developer to work on that, you have to change this in giving when and then so that they can know how to code it. So this is what you are saying.
Yes, so a little bit different. So if we were to give the developer this, lots of organizations, so I want to be very, very clear, right? Lots of organizations just use user story, just what you see here. In my experience and what I teach, I encourage you guys to add the acceptance criteria here with the user story because it gives additional clarity to the developers and to the QA folks when you provide the user story. When you just leave it at this level, it leaves a lot of room for interpretation, right? But if you add additional details, here's where, when we talk about prototypes, is also helpful. So if you have prototypes and you understand how the functionality needs to work, you can add that additional detail in the acceptance criteria. So you're right that using this acceptance criteria given, when, then approach is what lots of companies are moving towards. Not all companies are there yet. Lots of companies are moving towards this approach, provides additional clarity to developers, to QA folks, to the entire project team on what it is that, how can we call this user story done? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions on this?
Surabjit, this is Sajini. Just have a quick question. So is there a scenario where a user story would not be accompanied with an acceptance criteria?
So as I said, lots of companies are just using the user story format, the standard one that you see. So they are implementing software or products just using this. But it is really not the best approach. So
Okay.
to answer your question, are companies using just this approach? Yes. But lots of companies are starting to adopt adding this additional acceptance criteria because, again, it provides a lot more clarity and guidance on how this should look. And what that does is it reduces on the back end, finding defects or, putting this user story back on the product backlog because we can't call it done. So the definition of done becomes a little blurred when we're just seeing just the user story.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So last week we talked about creating the product backlog. This is what we created together. So I put this in the PowerPoint presentation. Today, in what I just explained to you guys, how do we write user story? Here's a format that we're going to follow. So I will fix this right now and then copy this.
Sarabjit, a question here. So if this user story has much more to communicate, like we have to attach a form that defines the fields, the input fields, or there is some kind of furthermore added to this. So we just tag that to this user story, or we do it in a different place, mentioning the user story name or ID.
We would add it to as part of the user story. So
Okay.
I think what I explained maybe in this user story, or I'm sorry, maybe in our session or some other training that I've done, we always have to be mindful. There's always at least two types of things that we're building. We're building the front end and we're building the back end, right? The front end is what is visible to our users, right? In our case, it's people looking at recipes or submitting recipes for review. That would be the front end, what users can see and interact with. And then there's always a database on the back end. So depending on what it is that the user story that we're writing could have front end tasks for developers and back end tasks for developers. So generally what we see is your agile team or your team of developers is made up of some front-end folks, front-end developers, and some back-end. There are full stack developers as well that could do front-end and back-end, but generally when we talk about developers, they either like to do one or the other, right? They just, some prefer working on making the front end easily accessible and pretty, and then there's some that just want to focus on the data on the back end.
Correct.
To answer your question, Avanya, we would go back. And so let's say if we are writing a user story about, fields that would be included, that would be part of our user story.
Okay.
So here's our product backlog. This is what we started with last week, or not last week, the last time we met. I know we had a 1 week gap, but this is what we came up with as our product backlog. Now, what we do once we have a product backlog, generally, there's a whole process of prioritization. There's a whole process of identifying which are high, medium, and low, higher priority than others. There's a whole process of identifying the MVP, which we're not going there yet, right? All I'm trying to show you guys is the core parts of when you're writing a user, creating a case study for an interview. These are the major parts that you want to identify, is showcasing how do you get to a product backlog, right? And then from a product backlog, how do you document or showcase some level of user stories so they understand that you know how to create user stories. Now, on the surface, right? I'm sure you guys have seen this format and you're all like, oh my God, this is so easy. Why is everybody making a big deal out of user stories? And it's because when you start to write them yourself, they are a bit complicated because you have to follow a format in which, defines the functionality that you want to build, but also give it as enough detail where somebody from a development standpoint could look at this and say, okay, to call this user story done, I need to do 5 things. And here are those 5 things, which are then called tasks and are divided out to different developers. Does that make sense? Does that conceptually and theoretically, does that concept make sense to you guys?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so let's, we're not gonna do all user stories today. We'll do a couple together, and then if you guys want, you can write these, create user stories on your own and send them to me. I'm happy to take a look and give you guys feedback, but let's start out and do a couple. So I think this one is the process of submitting new recipes. We say a button on the website to submit new recipes. Identify type of user submitting the recipe is a doctor. So create a form for people to submit new recipes, required fields, create a form for people to submit new recipes, filters, and then create a form for people to submit new recipe, optional fields. So all what we're doing here is creating a form to allow people to submit a recipe. And if I were to just create a user story to have, one user story to talk about everything that's needed on the form, that user story and everything under it will be humongous. So what we're going to try to do is create user stories for each of these items, or some of these things. And do you guys have a preference on what you guys want me to create a user story on? Let's just start with these. Okay, so this talks about a button on the website to submit new recipes. So here's how we're gonna do this. So and you guys help me out. I'm doing this on the fly, so let me know if you guys want me to increase the font to make this a little bit more clear. So we're creating at this point a user story for this. And I'm just putting it here so I don't have to flip back and forth. So who do you guys think that this functionality is for? Somebody who needs to click on submit new recipes. Who is doing that action?
It could be a doctor or a caretaker.
Yeah.
Or a patient also, right?
Yeah. So let's
Patient as option.
So let's take it from a patient standpoint, and then the next one we can do from doctor. So as a patient, so that what? Have the ability to submit new. Now, what I explained, the acceptance criteria given when. So in us creating a user story that talks about somebody clicking on a button called submit new recipes, right? How should this work? So if it's a patient, are we saying that they need to be logged in or registered in the portal? Probably not, right? Or should they be?
They have to be registered. Only then they have access to the website.
Okay, so then the precondition to making this successful is the patient has to be successfully logged into the portal, right? So given the patient, given when the patient clicks, so logged into the portal and are on the, they have to be on
And the registered user.
successfully logged in into the portal as a registered user. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. When given the patient is, we can say given the patient is a registered user.
Okay. Given the patient is a registered user, logged in, right?
Yes.
Just because they're a registered user doesn't mean anything. So they're logged in and are plus
into the
what did we call, do you guys remember what we called this page? I'll just say they're on the recipe page. So given that the patient is a registered user and they're logged in and they're on the recipes page, when the patient clicks on submit new
Submit new recipe.
recipe, then what should happen? So when somebody clicks on this button, what should happen?
Templates to submit the recipes.
I'm sorry, what?
They have the ability to, then they get the ability to post the recipe successfully so that they can
So I'm
so that they can go back and check on it, or
yeah.
they
So
can
yeah,
look for it later, right, whenever required.
right. So when they click on this new button, we're not going into super detail, but when they click on this button, right, they have now the ability to see the new recipe form, right? So that's all this user story needs to allow them to do is when somebody clicks on the new submit new recipe, right? They're registered, they're logged in, they're on the recipes page. They see a button when they click on submit new recipe. The result of this user story is to allow the user to see a new recipe form, which will then, another user story will be about the required fields, right? So that's what, from this user story standpoint, as long as we create this button and then provide what needs to happen after they click on the button, we're successful. So when we're writing this acceptance criteria, given, when, then, I want you to think about given is the precondition. This is the action for the user story. And then this is the result of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Does that make sense, you guys? Yes, no?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Usually I like to bold these out because it's easy for me to like visibly just go down the list. So the next one is identify. Okay, so this user story is not done yet, right? So this is from a patient standpoint. What about if it's a doctor that is going in or a caretaker that's going in and submitting this? Is the behavior going to be any different? What do you guys think?
It's the same, I guess. Whoever it is first, they have to be registered to get into the website, right?
But what if we, so maybe, and again, you guys, I'm totally making this up. Maybe the patient doesn't have to be registered, right? Because it's going through a review process. Somebody's going to take a look at it, at the recipe, and see if it's viable and approve it or not. But anybody like a doctor or a caretaker, maybe they don't submit recipes through the public website. Maybe they're submitting recipes through some other format or some,
But
through the admin panel.
how are we going to check when they say it's when they select the patient and they need not be registered? How are we going to check by their details if they are exactly a patient, or we should have a predefined database with us so that we can check?
Right, but you're saying that, but do you think to submit recipes that somebody needs to be registered somewhere?
Yeah, we did talk about a registration form, right, initially.
Okay, I may have forgotten, but just generally speaking, like let's say if we're an organization and we're having a hard time collecting recipes, generally, to submit recipes, it probably doesn't need to be a registered user. So if that was the case, then these user stories would be a little bit different. But I forgot the discussions that we had about, anybody on the site needs to be a registered user and such. So you're probably right. But I'm just saying, in the event that we didn't need to have registered users to submit the recipe, then the user stories would be different. From this standpoint, all we're saying is if the functionality is completely the same, then nothing changes. So
Registration is mandatory, Sarabjit, because I have made a note of earlier sessions.
okay.
So we did talk about registering for the staff or supervisor or admin.
Okay, sounds good. I forgot. So that's fine. So from this user story standpoint, nothing, the functionality doesn't change. So whoever it is that's submitting the recipe first has to authenticate on the website, whether they're a patient, doctor, or caretaker, and then they can go ahead and submit the recipe.
Yes. So I have a question at this point. Like in case if there is a scenario that suppose patients need not register, only doctors or caregivers has to register, or if that is the ask from the business, how would we actually check on the person whether the person we have to check, right?
Well, no, because if the business or the organization doesn't care who the recipes are coming from, like, yes, they'll have to provide their email address and contact information, right, when they're submitting the recipe. But if they
Mhm.
don't have to be a registered user of the site, then it doesn't matter. Then we would just say, given that the patient is on our website and on the recipes page, then when they click on the submit new button, they have the ability to see the new recipe form.
Okay.
So we don't then at that point have to get them. This would be a little bit different. Just we would
Yes.
do this.
Okay.
And maybe, submit new recipes. Maybe our doctors and caretakers, because they're part of the okay. So doctor and caretaker could be any doctor and caretaker, right? So I think there's another user story here. So let's say if so on the admin panel, so where people that work for this organization, right? They have a different view. So these user stories are for the public website, right? There is an admin panel where they're reviewing and approving recipes. So there is a user story, not under this one, but another user story to say, as somebody who's working for this organization, if they want to submit new recipes, there's probably another submit new recipes that doesn't need to go through the approval process. Does that make sense?
Right. Only if they are from the admin side.
Yeah. So as an admin user, I want to click on submit new recipes. So I have the ability. So given that I have logged into the admin panel, when I click on submit new recipes, then I have the ability to update the new recipe form. And we have to say this doesn't need to go into the approval process, right?
Yes.
And the recipe, how do I say this? Then the new recipe submitted is displayed on the
Saranjit, I didn't get this line. Then have the ability to update the new recipe form. Does that mean he's already updating an existing one, or
I'm just saying to update me.
click on submit new recipe? He has the ability to access the new recipe form, maybe.
Yeah, that's more accurate. Okay,
Access
so
new-
we just now wrote 3 user stories, one from a patient standpoint, one for any doctor caretaker in the world, and then another user story for the same functionality from an admin standpoint, right?
Sarabjit, one thing I think we have to note down at some place about what are the privileges an admin has.
Yes.
So that whenever there is admin as the user,
Mhm.
We should not get confused because every time we have a discussion, what is
Yeah.
the admin actually
Well,
doing at this particular
Thankfully, this is a case study, and thankfully, this is a case study. So we're done with user stories this week. Next week, I'm going to show you guys how to do prototyping a little bit, so that you guys could include prototypes in your user stories. That will make it a little bit, again, further help out the developers and the QA folks in what it is that we're working on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
So-
as a business analyst, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, I have a question.
Yeah.
When you're looking at the user story that is being created, for that of the admin, after you said given, when, then, and then again, the second time, I didn't really get that. Like, why is then repeating itself again?
Because
Or is it
go ahead.
sorry, is it because it has not been fully clarified, or what? I didn't get that actually.
So this is the precondition, this is the action, and this is the result. So there are scenarios where we need more than one result to happen. Sorry. And so that's why I've added two then statements.
Okay. Okay. So sorry if I'm wrong, but so is it possible that we can have when twice as well, or that does not work that way?
Yeah, there could be conditions where you need to, there's two, well, given you can, so because this is the action, you should only focus on one action per user story, right?
Mhm.
But then, so let's say if, there could be two outcomes from this action, but this action, you should focus on one per user story.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think from his question, it's like a nested condition, but here I think it'd be wise to go with one.
Yeah.
If you have more, what's another one?
Yeah. Otherwise, if you have two actions happening and within one user story, then the user story becomes really complex and hard for. So the goal of user story is to break down functionality in manageable chunks, right? So that it could be assigned to many different folks. So when we create this as an admin user, when I click on the ability to create new recipes, so I have the ability to do this. What developers will do is when they look at this user story, they know that they need to have a front-end developer create the button, right? And I'm not a developer, so I'm just totally making this up just so you guys could understand what's happening in the background. Submit new button, submit new recipe. Right? Then so they will have a front-end developer create a button. They'll need to know where on the page this needs to go. And then they will need to know outcome. So when after somebody's clicking on it, lots of background noise. I'm going to put some of you guys on mute. So when somebody clicks on this submit new recipe button, what's the outcome? Like, should a new page be populated? Right? So if there's a new page, right, with the form, that's again, somebody creating the form. And so there may be other tasks, but I'm just outlining to complete this one user story. There's at least 4 or 5 things that the developers need to do to complete this user story, which are then broken down into tasks. And if you add too many actions in one user story, then the list of tasks become large. So generally, we want to have sizable user stories so that we could break these things down and could manage a couple of user stories within the sprint. That's outside of the scope what I'm covering. As I said, I'm not a developer, but I'm just trying to give you guys an understanding of why we want to keep user stories into manageable chunks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so here, I think we are at time. We created these 3 user stories. Why don't you guys take a stab as an assignment to do more user stories? And as I said, you guys can email me once you're done, and I'm more than happy to give you some feedback on your format of writing user stories. So pick any 1 or 2 items from the product backlog, and why don't you practice writing the user stories, and then I can give you practice on that. I'm sorry, I can give you feedback on that.
So how do we get the backlog?
I can send this to you. I can email this to you guys.
Yes, please. Thank you.
And I'll send you my email address so you guys can send your user stories to me for feedback.
Can you please send the 3 user story that we created to with it?
Yeah, I'll send you actually here, you guys. Let me just share this document with you guys right now so you have it. Okay, you guys should have access to that document that has our product backlog and everything that we worked on today.
Okay.
All right, any questions on what?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. All right, guys. So next,
I have a question.
Mhm.
So when let's say there are multiple recipes being entered into the website, do we write user stories for that part of task where all these are being stored? Because this needs to be stored in the backend somewhere.
So the user story would be when a new recipe is submitted, then it gets added to the database. So I think that user story will be at the point of approval. Even when it's being submitted, it's going into a database somewhere, right? It's not
Yes.
like it's flying out in nowhere land. It's going into a database, it's being saved. But when it's approved, then it gets saved in a different area or different table for approved recipes versus those that are still pending approval.
Okay. Because the user might come back and check using the ID or the recipe ID or something, or we also gave an option for them to modify an existing one.
Yeah.
So do we write that task as such where it's being stored, or it's just left to the developers to decide?
We generally, from our standpoint, we don't get into all those details.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
We have, back-end developers and we have front-end developers. We generally just show them, and we're mostly concerned from a front-end standpoint, like how is it going to look for our users? It has to be easy and intuitive for them to get through this process. But in terms of how it's being saved, generally we're not too concerned about that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, guys, next week is our last week. I'm going to show you guys, or I'm going to have somebody come talk to us about prototyping. I myself am not great at prototyping. I just do the stick figures, and that's helped me so far in my career. Generally, when you're working on a team, you do have UX designers that will do mock-ups and prototypes for you guys, but there will be scenarios where you won't have those resources available, maybe because it's a smaller project, or maybe those resources just are not available. So the way that we do prototypes is another way that we validate requirements. It helps us to visualize how things should look like, and providing that information, if we have it, to our developers and our QA folks, again, makes what it is that they're coding a little bit easier. So that's why we use prototyping. And if I can't find somebody who's really good at it, then you'll be stuck with me doing my stick figures. And they've worked just fine for me in my career, and I'm hoping that they'll work fine for you as well. But I'm fingers crossed, I'm going to try to find somebody, one of my folks that is really good at doing prototypes, so you guys can have an understanding of what that looks like. So that's all I have for you guys this week, you guys. Thank you so much. If you have additional questions, we'll be meeting again one more week, and then we'll call this case study done.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. How was your wedding? How was your brother's wedding?
It was awesome. It was exhausting and it was awesome. Really good.
Okay,
Thank you,
great.
Val.
You're welcome.
All
Bye.
right. Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Yeah,
Sarah.
bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah, bye. Take care.